March 17th, 1943. The pre-dawn sky over East Anglia hung heavy with moisture, a thin veil of fog clinging to the grass airfields that stretched across the English countryside. At RAF Marham, the ground crews moved in practiced silence, their breath visible in the cold morning air. The sound that broke the stillness was not the thunderous roar of Bristol Hercules radials or the deep-throated rumble of Allison V. 1710s. It was something altogether different, a high-pitched, almost musical whine that seemed to slice through the fog itself. From the dispersal area, a shape emerged, sleek, impossibly smooth, painted in a mottled camouflage that made it appear to shimmer in the half-light. No gun turrets interrupted its lines. No defensive armament bristled from its fuselage. The de Havilland Mosquito rolled toward the runway, and in that moment, it carried with it a secret that would challenge everything the Americans believed about strategic bombing. The wooden frame trembled slightly as the twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines spooled to full power, their combined 4,000 horsepower transforming the delicate-looking aircraft into something predatory. Within seconds, it was airborne, climbing at a rate that would have astonished any observer familiar with conventional bombers. But there were no observers this morning, save for the ground crew who watched it disappear into the cloud base, with a mixture of pride and something approaching reverence. They knew what the Americans stationed at nearby bases did not yet understand, that this unarmed wooden aircraft could accomplish what no formation of flying fortresses could dare attempt. And that knowledge created a tension that would ripple through the Allied command structure for years to come. By the spring of 1943, the strategic bombing campaign over Europe had settled into a brutal arithmetic. The United States Army Air Forces had committed itself to a doctrine of daylight precision bombing, predicated on the belief that tight formations of heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses could fight their way to any target in occupied Europe and return. The theory was elegant. Each B-17 carried 13 50-caliber machine guns, and when assembled in combat box formations of 18 to 27 aircraft, they created overlapping fields of fire that could theoretically destroy any attacking fighter. The Norden bomb sight, mounted in the nose of each bomber, promised unprecedented accuracy, the ability to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, or so the propaganda claimed. American commanders spoke confidently of destroying Germany's war-making capacity through precision strikes against specific industrial targets. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories. The philosophy was thoroughly American. Technological superiority and industrial might would overwhelm any adversary through sheer application of force. Indeed, reality above the Reich was proving catastrophically different. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched simultaneous raids against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, deep penetration missions that represented the culmination of American strategic doctrine. 376 bombers took off that morning. 60 failed to return. 594 airmen were killed or captured. The wounded numbered in the hundreds. German fighters, freed from worrying about escort range, executed coordinated attacks that shredded formations. Flak batteries, warned by radar and connected through an integrated air defense network, turned the sky over target areas into fields of exploding steel. The bombers that returned bore testimony to the violence they had endured. Aircraft with sections of wing torn away, tail gunners frozen to death at their stations, pilots nursing shattered aircraft home on prayers and failing hydraulics. And for all this sacrifice, bomb damage assessment photographs showed disappointingly scattered results. The pickle barrel remained elusive. Yet, during this same period, a handful of wooden British aircraft were routinely penetrating German airspace, photographing bomb damage, striking precision targets, and returning without loss. The Americans knew this. They received the reconnaissance photographs that Mosquito squadrons produced. They read the intelligence reports. They attended briefings where RAF officers casually mentioned Mosquito operations to Berlin, to Munich, to targets deep in Norway and Denmark, and it infuriated them. Because the Mosquito violated every principle of American strategic bombing doctrine. It was unarmed. It carried a bomb load that was laughably small by B-17 standards, 2 tons compared to the Fortress's 6. It was made of wood, for God's sake, held together with glue while American aircraft were riveted from aluminum alloy. It flew with a crew of 2 rather than the B-17's 10 highly trained specialists, and yet it survived where the Fortresses died. The Americans had expected to come to Britain as the saviors of the bombing campaign, bringing industrial might and technological sophistication to replace what they viewed as the RAF's crude area bombing tactics. The 8th Air Force crews were the cream of American aviation. College-educated, extensively trained, confident in their equipment and their doctrine. They had watched the training films showing how the Norden sight could place bombs with surgical precision. They had practiced formation flying until it became second nature. They believed in the mission with an almost religious fervor. Strategic bombing would shorten the war, save lives, bring democracy's technological triumph to bear against fascist militarism. The sacrifice would be worth it because the cause was just and the method was scientific. What they experienced instead was industrial slaughter on a scale that made a mockery of their confidence. Every mission deeper than the range of escort fighters became a gauntlet of terror. The Luftwaffe had adapted, developing tactics specifically designed to break up American formations. Head-on attacks by fighters carrying cannons and rockets forced bombers to take violent evasive action, disrupting the precise formations that were supposed to guarantee survival. Flak grew heavier and more accurate with each passing month, and the human cost mounted with mathematical inevitability. 8th Air Force statistics from late 1943 showed that a bomber crew's chances of surviving a 25-mission tour stood at approximately 1 in 4. 25 missions was the requirement for rotation home, but the numbers said that 3 out of 4 crews would be shot down before reaching that goal. Men lived with this arithmetic, calculating odds, watching friends disappear, understanding that each mission brought them statistically closer to death. In this context of mounting losses and failing doctrine, the Mosquito became an object of fascination and resentment. American airmen watched them take off on nights when the bomber streams were grounded by weather, watched them return when B-17 formations were being decimated over Germany. They heard the stories, how a single Mosquito had bombed Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen with such precision that the resistance leaders held in the basement survived. How Mosquitoes had struck the Philips radio factory in Eindhoven in a daring low-level raid that destroyed the target while avoiding a nearby hospital. How Mosquito pilots flew to Berlin and back while American crews were still struggling to reach targets in the Ruhr. And with each story, the question grew more insistent. If a wooden aircraft with no defensive armament could survive over Germany, what did that say about American doctrine? The psychological impact was profound. B-17 crews had been trained to believe that their survival depended on maintaining formation, on the mutual protection provided by mass defensive fire. They had been taught that speed and altitude alone were suicide, that only the combat box formation could provide adequate protection. The Mosquito demonstrated the opposite, that speed and altitude were themselves the ultimate defense, that the weight and complexity of defensive armament could be better invested in performance. Every Mosquito that returned from Berlin was a silent indictment of American strategic choices. It suggested that perhaps the deaths of so many young Americans were not the inevitable price of strategic bombing, but the consequence of flawed doctrine. The wooden aircraft that caused such consternation had been born from desperation and bureaucratic obstinacy. In 1938, Jeffrey de Havilland proposed to the Air Ministry a concept that seemed almost perverse: a bomber built entirely of wood, powered by the most powerful engines available, stripped of all defensive armament, designed to simply outrun enemy fighters. The Air Ministry rejected the proposal repeatedly. It violated established doctrine. It wasted high-performance engines that could be used in fighters. Wood construction was obsolete, a throwback to the First World War. The Mosquito survived these objections only through de Havilland's stubborn insistence and the intervention of a few far-sighted officers who understood that conventional wisdom was leading toward disaster. The aircraft that emerged from this difficult gestation was a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency. The fuselage was constructed of balsa wood sandwiched between layers of birch plywood, creating a monocoque structure that was simultaneously light and immensely strong. The wings used a similar construction, and the entire aircraft was held together with casein glue, literally derived from milk protein. To American engineers trained in metal construction and mass production, this seemed like medieval craftsmanship, unsuited to modern warfare. But the wooden construction provided unexpected advantages. It was lighter than an equivalent aluminum structure, contributing to the aircraft's exceptional performance. It was largely invisible to the primitive radar systems of the early war years, and critically, it could be produced by small furniture manufacturers and craftsmen, bypassing the bottlenecks in aluminum supply and heavy industrial capacity that limited fighter production. The performance specifications of the production Mosquito read like fantasy to American planners. Maximum speed exceeded 400 miles per hour, faster than most contemporary fighters. Service ceiling reached 40,000 feet. Range with bomb load exceeded 1,500 miles, and the climb rate was spectacular. It could reach 30,000 feet in just over 12 minutes. A formation of B-17s required 30 minutes to assemble and climb to operational altitude, during which they were vulnerable and burning fuel. A Mosquito could be over the channel before a B-17 formation had finished forming up. This performance envelope meant that Mosquito operations followed entirely different logic than American heavy bomber missions. They flew alone or in pairs, using speed and altitude as their primary defense. They operated in weather that would ground conventional bombers. They struck targets of opportunity with minimal planning time. And they survived. The bomb load that Americans dismissed as inadequate proved devastatingly effective when applied with precision. A Mosquito could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, 2 tons, to Berlin and back. This was less than a third of a B-17's maximum load, but the B-17 rarely carried its maximum load to Berlin. More importantly, the Mosquito could place those bombs with accuracy that American formations could not match. Flying alone, without the need to synchronize bombing runs with dozens of other aircraft, Mosquito crews could make multiple approaches to the target, could compensate for wind and visibility, could ensure accurate delivery. The results were evident in reconnaissance photographs. When Mosquitoes struck the Burmeister and Wayne engine factory in Copenhagen, they destroyed the target machine shop while leaving surrounding buildings intact. When they attacked the Gestapo headquarters at Aarhus University, they demolished the Nazi offices while students in other parts of the building survived. This was the precision bombing that American doctrine promised but could not deliver. Perhaps most galling to American crews was the casual confidence of Mosquito pilots. They spoke of operations to Berlin as routine milk runs, something to be accomplished before lunch. They flew without the elaborate briefings and mission planning that preceded every B-17 raid. A Mosquito crew could receive orders in the morning, study maps over breakfast, take off after lunch, bomb the target, and be back for dinner. The contrast with American operations was stark. A mission to Berlin required days of planning, involved hundreds of aircraft and thousands of men, consumed vast quantities of fuel and ammunition, and resulted in dozens of losses. Mosquito crews did the same thing with 2 men and some plywood, and they made it look easy. The psychological effect on American bomber crews was corrosive. They had been told they were flying the finest bomber in the world, that American technology and doctrine would win the war. The Mosquito suggested they had been lied to. The wooden aircraft became a symbol of everything the Americans resented about British methods: improvisation, pragmatism, a willingness to abandon doctrine when it failed to match reality. American military culture valued systematic approaches, standardization, the application of industrial processes to warfare. The B-17 embodied these values. It was mass-produced, heavily standardized, crewed by specialists who each performed specific roles. The Mosquito was the opposite, a craftsman-built aircraft that required its crew to be generalists, that relied on individual skill rather than systematic process. It represented an older tradition of warfare, one that Americans thought they had transcended. And the fact that this older tradition was proving more effective was deeply disturbing. The tension came to a head at staff meetings and planning sessions throughout 1943 and early 1944. British officers, with barely concealed exasperation, would suggest that American losses could be reduced by adopting Mosquito-style tactics: smaller formations, faster aircraft, reliance on speed rather than defensive firepower. American commanders rejected these suggestions with arguments that revealed the depth of their commitment to existing doctrine. The United States, they pointed out, had the industrial capacity to produce thousands of heavy bombers and train tens of thousands of crew members. Shifting to a Mosquito-style approach would waste this advantage. Furthermore, American precision bombing doctrine required large formations to ensure adequate bomb density on target. A few Mosquitoes might destroy a single building, but destroying Germany's industrial capacity required the mass delivery of high explosives that only heavy bomber formations could achieve. The losses, however terrible, were acceptable in pursuit of strategic objectives. The Mosquito was a tactical nuisance, not a strategic weapon. These arguments had logic, but they could not mask the fundamental reality. American crews were dying at rates that made the 8th Air Force's position in England unsustainable. By the autumn of 1943, loss rates on unescorted missions to German targets were running at 10% or higher. At such rates, bomber crews faced mathematical certainty of death. The psychological strain was becoming visible. Men developed psychosomatic symptoms before missions. Cases of combat fatigue multiplied. Some simply broke, unable to board their aircraft for one more mission. The Air Force dealt with these cases harshly. Courts-martial, sentences to hard labor, public humiliation designed to discourage others from similar failures. But the underlying problem remained. American strategic bombing doctrine was consuming its own crews at a rate that could not be sustained. The wooden Mosquito continued its operations, indifferent to American doctrinal debates. By mid-1943, Mosquito squadrons were conducting operations that would have been considered impossible for heavy bombers. They flew to Berlin in broad daylight, relying on speed and altitude to evade fighters. They conducted precision strikes against individual buildings in occupied cities, using their agility to minimize civilian casualties. They flew nuisance raids at night, dropping small loads of bombs timed to detonate throughout the night, disrupting German industrial production and worker morale. They conducted photographic reconnaissance deep into German territory, bringing back intelligence that was essential to planning larger operations. And they did all of this with loss rates that were a small fraction of what the 8th Air Force endured. Between 1943 and 1945, Mosquito bomber squadrons flew approximately 28,000 sorties and lost fewer than 300 aircraft, a loss rate of roughly 1%. During the same period, American heavy bomber losses routinely exceeded 5% per mission, and frequently reached 10% or higher on deep penetration raids. The Americans gradually, grudgingly, began to acknowledge what the Mosquito represented. In late 1943 and early 1944, as long-range escort fighters began to extend their reach over Germany, the strategic situation changed. With fighter escort, American bomber formations could operate more safely, and loss rates declined. But the escort fighters succeeded by applying the same principle that the Mosquito embodied: Speed and performance were superior to defensive armament. The P-51 Mustang, which finally provided effective long-range escort, was lightly armed compared to German fighters, but its speed and maneuverability allowed it to dominate. The bombers it protected were still vulnerable, still suffered losses, but the fighter escort reduced casualties to marginally acceptable levels. And in the privacy of after-action reports and staff memoranda, American planners began to admit that perhaps a different approach to bombing doctrine might have been more effective. The transformation of opinion was gradual and never complete. American air doctrine officially remained committed to daylight precision bombing by heavy bomber formations throughout the war. But increasingly, special operations were assigned to smaller, faster aircraft. The Americans acquired photo-reconnaissance Mosquitoes and found them vastly superior to the modified B-17s they had been using. They observed RAF Mosquito Pathfinder operations with growing interest, noting how accurately these aircraft could mark targets for following bomber streams. Some American planners began advocating for development of a high-speed medium bomber that could apply Mosquito principles using American mass production techniques. These proposals were never implemented during the war. There was no time, and the industrial machinery for producing B-17s and B-24s could not easily be retooled. But the intellectual shift was significant. By 1945, many American air officers privately acknowledged that the Mosquito had been right and their doctrine had been flawed. The wooden aircraft that embodied this truth became more than just a tactical asset. It became a symbol of strategic flexibility, of the willingness to question established doctrine, of the value of performance over protection. In the officers' clubs and debriefing rooms of East Anglia, B-17 crews spoke of the Mosquito with a mixture of envy and resentment. They envied the freedom that Mosquito crews enjoyed, the absence of cumbersome formation flying, the ability to use individual initiative, the vastly improved survival odds. They resented what the Mosquito's success implied about their own sacrifices, that perhaps so many of their friends had died, not because strategic bombing required such costs, but because American doctrine had insisted on a flawed approach. The wooden aircraft had become a mirror in which American airmen saw reflected their own institution's failures. The psychological impact extended beyond operational crews to the highest levels of command. American air generals had staked their professional reputations on the theory of strategic bombing. They had promised that air power alone could win the war, that invasion would be unnecessary if bombers could destroy Germany's industrial base. The Mosquito did not threaten this strategic vision, but it did threaten the specific doctrine that American commanders had developed. If a small, fast, undefended bomber was more effective than a large, slow, heavily defended one, then the entire American approach needed to be reconsidered. And such reconsideration would implicitly acknowledge that American crews had died because of flawed planning and institutional stubbornness. This was a truth that few commanders were willing to face publicly. The wooden airframe thus carried a burden beyond its physical bomb load. Each Mosquito sortie was an implicit argument against American doctrine. Each successful mission demonstrated that speed and performance could substitute for defensive armament. Each low-loss operation highlighted the casualties that American methods were producing. The tension this created was never fully resolved during the war. American and British officers maintained public unity, but in private discussions and classified memoranda, the debate raged. British officers pointed to Mosquito's success as evidence that American methods were unnecessarily costly. American officers responded that British methods could not achieve the scale of destruction needed to cripple German industry. Both positions had merit, and neither side convinced the other. The wooden aircraft remained a source of friction, a reminder that allies could disagree profoundly about fundamental questions of strategy. By 1944, as Allied air superiority over Europe became overwhelming, the operational differences between American heavy bombers and British Mosquitoes became less critical. With fighter escort available throughout the mission profile, B-17 and B-24 formations could operate with acceptable losses. German fighter strength declined as fuel became scarce and experienced pilots were killed. The strategic bombing campaign continued with American heavy bombers delivering the mass destruction that doctrine demanded, while Mosquitoes conducted precision operations that required surgical accuracy. The two approaches coexisted, each suited to different mission profiles. But the underlying question remained unresolved. Had American methods been the only way to achieve strategic objectives? Or had they been a costly mistake that stubbornness and institutional pride prevented from being corrected? The men who flew the missions carried these questions with them. B-17 crews who survived their tours returned to the United States as heroes, decorated and celebrated. Many of them carried psychological scars that would not fully manifest for years. They had endured losses and trauma that marked them permanently, and some of them, in the privacy of veteran gatherings and late-night conversations, spoke of the Mosquito with a bitterness that time did not erase. They spoke of the wooden aircraft as a reminder of what might have been, a different approach that might have saved lives, a doctrine that might have spared them the trauma of watching friends die while the strategic benefit remained unclear. These conversations were private, never officially recorded, but they revealed the depth of the psychological wound that the Mosquito's success had created. The wooden airframe, built of plywood and glue, constructed by craftsmen rather than industrial workers, became a symbol more powerful than its designers had intended. It represented not just technological achievement but philosophical difference. The British empirical tradition of adapting methods to reality versus the American systematic tradition of adapting reality to methods. It demonstrated that sometimes the simplest solution, the one that violated established doctrine and seemed to retreat from technological complexity, could be more effective than sophisticated approaches that failed to account for operational reality. The Mosquito was faster, simpler, more versatile, and more survivable than the heavy bombers whose crews both admired and resented it. And this simplicity was itself a kind of sophistication. The wisdom to recognize that performance and versatility mattered more than size and armament. The production statistics tell their own story. Britain manufactured approximately 7,700 Mosquitoes during the war, using resources that would have produced perhaps 2,000 heavy bombers. Those 7,700 aircraft flew over 300,000 sorties in roles ranging from bomber to fighter to reconnaissance aircraft. They could be adapted to missions that heavy bombers could never attempt: low-level precision strikes, night fighting, maritime patrol, tactical support. American heavy bombers, for all their capabilities, remained locked into the strategic role for which they had been designed. The Mosquito's versatility meant that it remained useful throughout the war and beyond, while heavy bombers became increasingly vulnerable as jet fighters and improved anti-aircraft systems emerged. The wooden aircraft's basic design was sound, enough that variants continued in service into the 1950s, long after American wartime bombers had been retired. The fear that American bomber crews felt was never fear of the Mosquito itself. It was fear of what the Mosquito represented. It was fear that their sacrifices had been unnecessary, that better methods existed, but institutional inertia had prevented their adoption. It was fear that the doctrine they had been taught, the methods they had practiced, the formations they had flown at such cost, had been based on flawed assumptions. This fear was never openly acknowledged in official histories. The American narrative of strategic bombing remained triumphant. Industrial might and technological superiority had prevailed. Civilian populations had been spared the costs of ground invasion. The war had been shortened. But among the men who had flown the missions, who had watched the flak tear through formations, who had counted the empty bunks after each raid, there existed a parallel narrative. In this private history, the Mosquito stood as evidence of missed opportunities, of doctrinal rigidity that had cost lives, The emotional truth of the Mosquito transcended its tactical capabilities. American airmen did not fear the aircraft itself. They feared the questions it raised about their own experience. They had been told that their suffering served a purpose, that the losses were necessary, that American methods were superior. The wooden aircraft suggested otherwise. It suggested that perhaps the British had understood something that American planners had missed, that in the skies over Europe, survivability mattered more than bomb load, that speed was the ultimate defensive weapon, that two skilled crew members in a fast aircraft could achieve more than 10 crew members in a formation that made itself vulnerable by its own mass. These were painful truths for men who had survived by believing in the doctrine that had endangered them. In the immediate post-war years, as the United States Air Force emerged as an independent service and began developing doctrine for the atomic age, the lessons of the Mosquito were partially absorbed. American planners recognized that the future of strategic bombing lay with fast, high-flying aircraft rather than formations of piston-engine bombers. The B-47 and B-52 jet bombers that emerged in the 1950s embodied Mosquito principles. They relied on speed and altitude for survival rather than defensive armament. The experience of the 8th Air Force over Germany had taught that formations of slow bombers, however heavily armed, could not survive against determined opposition. The institutional resistance to this lesson had delayed its implementation, but ultimately, reality had forced doctrine to change. The Mosquito had been proven correct, but the validation came too late for the men who had died learning the lesson. The wooden aircraft itself passed into history as a curious footnote. The warplane built of plywood that had outperformed metal bombers. The unarmed aircraft that survived while its heavily defended contemporaries died. Aviation historians debate its significance, some arguing that it was a unique product of specific circumstances, others maintaining that it demonstrated timeless principles about performance and survivability. But for the American bomber crews who operated alongside Mosquito squadrons during the war, the aircraft's significance was never in doubt. It was a reminder of the price of doctrinal rigidity, of institutional pride that prevented adaptation, of sacrifices demanded by flawed planning. The Mosquito had not caused American losses. Luftwaffe, fighters and flak batteries had done that, but it had revealed those losses to be avoidable, consequences of strategic choices rather than inevitable costs of war. The wooden wings that sliced through the pre-dawn sky over East Anglia carried more than bombs and reconnaissance cameras. They carried an argument about how wars should be fought, about whether doctrine should bend to reality or reality should be forced to conform to doctrine. They carried evidence that sometimes smaller and faster defeats, larger and more powerful. They carried the implicit accusation that institutions serve themselves at the expense of the men who must execute their plans. And they carried a truth that made them feared, not by the enemy, but by the allies who witnessed their success. The truth that American bomber crews died not because their mission was impossible, but because their methods were wrong, and that this truth had been evident from the beginning to anyone willing to see it. The morning fog lifts over the airfields of East Anglia, revealing runways that have long since returned to farmland. The wooden aircraft are gone, rotted or scrapped or preserved in museums where their streamlined forms seem impossibly fragile. The men who flew them and the men who watched them fly are mostly gone as well, taking with them the first-hand knowledge of what it meant to see a plywood bomber do what aluminum fortresses could not. But the questions remain. They remain in the archives of after-action reports and staff memoranda, where doctrinal debates were recorded. They remain in the statistics of loss rates and sortie counts that show the mathematical reality of different approaches to strategic bombing. And they remain in the memory of how a wooden aircraft built by craftsmen, powered by engines designed for fighters, stripped of defensive weapons, and held together with glue derived from milk, became the mirror in which an Air Force saw reflected the cost of its own certainties. In the end, the Mosquito taught a lesson that transcends its particular time and place. It taught that effectiveness in war comes not from adherence to doctrine, but from adaptation to reality. It taught that survival depends on understanding the actual conditions of combat, rather than the theoretical models developed in peacetime. It taught that sometimes the simplest solution, the one that violates established wisdom and seems to retreat from technological sophistication, can be more effective than complex systems that fail to account for operational truth. And it taught that institutions resist these lessons until the cost of resistance becomes unbearable, and that the men who pay that cost are rarely the ones who imposed the doctrine that demanded it. The wooden aircraft feared by no enemy, but respected by all who understood its significance remains a testament to these truths. It flies now only in historical memory, but the questions it raised about doctrine and adaptation, about institutional rigidity and individual sacrifice, about the relationship between what military forces believe and what combat reality demands, these questions remain as relevant as ever. The Mosquito demonstrated that wars are won not by the largest forces or the most sophisticated weapons, but by the clearest understanding of what the specific conditions of combat require. It demonstrated that sometimes the answer is not more armor or more guns or larger formations, but simply the wisdom to question whether the approach being taken serves the goal being pursued. And it demonstrated that this wisdom, simple as it seems, is the rarest quality in military institutions, because it requires the humility to admit that perhaps the plan was wrong, and the courage to change course despite the costs already paid. Tridive, morning sun breaks through the clouds, over the fields where the wooden bombers once flew, illuminating a landscape transformed by the passage of 8 decades. But the fundamental question remains unchanged: whether institutions can learn from their failures in time to prevent them from recurring, whether doctrine can adapt to reality before reality extracts its full price in blood, whether the example of a plywood bomber that outperformed the best that industrial might could produce might teach something worth remembering about the nature of effectiveness in war. The Mosquito suggests that the answer to these questions is available to those willing to look beyond doctrine to reality, beyond institutional pride to operational truth. But it also suggests that this willingness is rare and that its absence is measured in the lives of young men who died learning lessons their commanders should have known.